Hello, thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be explaining why it is that women wear earrings, the significance in the spiritual sense and also really in the sense of reality. The spiritual world is borne out by the physical world. And at the end I'll also touch on why men at times wear earrings and what that means and whether that is good or bad for men. But for the time being, let's talk about the subject at hand as to why women wear earrings. And to answer that question, we'll look at the creation of man in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. So Genesis 1:27 says, "And God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." So if we look at this, mankind, anthropon in Greek, the word here in the Hebrew is Adam, is comprised of both male and female. The word here for male in Greek is arsen, which means to be robust or coarse. The word here for female is thelu or thelus, which means delicate or tender, and also has a deeper meaning from a Greek word which means basically to suckle children. It's a reference to a woman's breast and her ability to nourish. But what I am interested in here is the Hebrew words because these are very telling. Now typically when reading the Old Testament it's better to read it in the Greek because the text is more reliable and accurate, and the Masoretes had a tendency of cutting things out of the text as far as content is concerned. But where the content is the same as the Greek, in my opinion it is safe to glean meaning from the words in the Hebrew text, so long as the content is equal to that of the Greek. And here it's basically the same. So let's look at the Hebrew words for male and female. The Hebrew word for male here is zakar, which means to remember, to commemorate, but the essential meaning in that is to impress or to pierce in the active. The word here for female in Hebrew is nakav. Nakav basically means to be pierced, to be bored through. Now, the meaning here with these two words, male and female, zakar for male to pierce and nakav for female to be pierced, I think the implications there are fairly obvious, so I'm not going to go into detail with that. But that really sets up what the relationship is between man and woman, male and female. We have the active male and the passive female. So of course, the piercing here is a reference to the sexual relationship between a man and a woman. And if you're interested in a deeper explanation of that, I have a good talk on my other video on the culture of virgins, women, and rape. And I go into great detail there on what actually transpires during the sexual act. So I won't go into detail here with that. So male means to pierce, female means to be pierced. Now before going on further, I'd like to talk about the basic structure of the human body for either male or female. And to point out the obvious, our bodies come in pairs. So we have two eyes, we have two nostrils, we have two ears. All our teeth come in pairs. We have two hands, 2 feet, 2 arms, 2 legs. And the corresponding male and female reproductive organs also come in pairs. If you consider the ovaries of a woman and the testicles of a man, those also come in pairs. So in that sense, men and women are the same. They are, you could say, human, as some like to translate. They are anthropon, man, is how the word appears in Greek, though it is masculine. But the main difference between man and woman in regards to this, I guess I'll call it a duality of the body. And I don't mean that in any Gnostic sense. I mean that everything comes in pairs. Is that the male is active. Everything in his body culminates to a single point. Whereas in the woman, everything begins at a single point and then spreads out to the two sides of her body. So you have the outward motion in the male body culminating in a single point, and you have the inward motion of the female body beginning from a single point. And of course at that point is where the male and female unite, where the two become one flesh. So, in a very literal sense, you could call the male essentially extroverted, that is to say, turned outward. And you can call the female introverted, that is to say, inward turning. And the two complement each other. And just for fun, we can look at nature and see where this manifests subconsciously in men and women who have probably never read this passage of scripture, never thought about it, never considered it. But look at the way a woman styles her hair in pigtails, right? You have the hair pulled apart in two different directions. That feels right. It looks right on a woman because it corresponds to her nature. And if you consider in men what we call the hairstyle mohawk or Mohican, patterned off of a hairstyle of a group of Native Americans called the Mohicans, who shave their heads to produce a mohawk or a single strand of hair going over through the center of the head. And also more widely known is the crest, the horsehair crest on top of the Greek and Roman helmets that correspond to this male temperament or this male instinct of culminating in a single point. And let me read a passage from Homer out of the Iliad showing this. So this is Robert Fagel's translation, which is a decent translation. And this is the Iliad, book 16, beginning in line 164. Quote, "And over his powerful head he set the well-forged helmet, the horsehair crest atop it tossing, bristling terror." So these are just two simple examples of where you see this awareness of the male and female body demonstrated, being expressed by individuals and cultures who have no idea that this verse, written by Moses in Genesis chapter 1, exists, and yet they still play it out, if you will. So when talking about piercing the ears, I have to make mention of a microcosm and the macrocosm. And basically what that means is that the reality that is borne out on the large scale is mimicked or mirrored on the little scale. So for example, during sexual union between a man and a woman, there is the active piercer and the passive pierced, the male and the female. You could say that is the macrocosm of this argument. But when you have the woman piercing her ears, that is a microcosm. You have the same idea. You have an active agent. You have the needle piercing the lobe of the ear, right? You have the active and you have the passive. But it's a reality that's actually happening to the person on a smaller scale, which mimics and corresponds and is meant to correspond, meant to signify the greater truth, the greater reality. So there is continuity in the person in expressing in their physical body what happens to them on the essential level, which also includes their body, of course. So it's significant that women pierce both ears, almost without fail. I don't think I've ever seen a woman with only one ear pierced. Now, there are many men who pierce both ears, and I'll explain what that means, in my view, at the end. But let me go forward for now with women piercing both their ears. So when Adam knew Eve, she conceived and bore a son, in the likeness and image of Adam. So when Adam knew Eve, it's not that he accumulated facts about her. He knew her on the ontological level, which is to say he knew her in her essence. The two became one flesh. That is to say, Eve's physical body became an extension of Adam. So the two were one flesh. The two bodies became one body. And so just as Adam has knowledge of his hand in a very essential way, right? The blood courses through his hand. And you can say Adam knows his hand. He feels it. He's aware of it. In the same way, he knows his wife, Eve, because they are now one flesh through sexual union. And through that union, through that impressing Adam upon Eve, the piercing of Adam upon Eve, you get the idea of remembrance, which I stated earlier, which is tied up in the meaning for Zakar. And you get that through his son. So memory is not just a recollection of the past. It is a commemoration, right? So you have Adam's face, and you have the face of his son, which looks just like Adam. It's in his image and likeness, right? So through the piercing process, Adam has now commemorated himself, has made a name for himself, so to speak. And he does this through his wife, through Eve, who is a willing participant, because she has the capacity to be impressed upon, right? To bear that image for Adam, to be pierced, if you will. And it's at this time that Adam names or calls his wife Eve. Prior to this, she was just being given the generic name woman. And so, of course, when Eve hears this name calling, if you will, she hears it with her ears, obviously. And so it is appropriate that the symbol of her union with Adam also happens in her ears, the place where she hears her name, her identity, which she shares with Adam, in which she is born and having a child with Adam, and remembering his likeness through her own body. So she pierces her ears to signify that, right? So Adam is her husband, her head, and he speaks, she responds, they have a son, they bear a child together. So she pierces her ears, the place where the words of Adam, the logos of Adam comes in and resonates with her and reproduces or commemorates his own image and likeness through the birthing of a son, another child, another human being, if you will. The son is born of Eve's body in a very similar way that Eve was born of Adam's body at the beginning. Eve was taken from, you could say, a hole in Adam's side. God cut a hole in the side of Adam, took his rib out, and formed Eve out of his body. And there on out, men are born of the female body from mothers, right, and not from the father like Eve had been. However, the fact that Eve was taken out of a cut or hole from Adam's body helps us to understand exactly what union means between a husband and a wife. And that brings up the word covenant. So if we look at Genesis chapter 15, verses 17 through 18, we have a ideal example of the word covenant being used again in the Hebrew language, which is very telling. So the story basically is that Abram, God commands him to take these animals and cut them in half, and to set the left side of the animal on the left side, the right side on the right side. And of course, if you remember, the human body is also comes in a left side and a right side. And of course, in union between a husband and wife, they're split down the middle. And so Abram does this with these animals. And then Abram falls asleep, and he sees a smoking oven pass between the pieces. And then he sees the flaming torch pass between the pieces. And it says that God makes a covenant with Abram. So in English, we say God made a covenant with Abraham, or with Abram. So we use the preposition with. The expression in Hebrew is God cut Abram a covenant. There is no preposition. There is God, who is the subject, and then there is Abram, who is the object. So God is cutting Abraham, and then cuts Abraham the covenant. The covenant is also the object. So you have a double object there. You have Abraham, and you have the covenant, and you have the cutter, or the covenant maker, which is God, the subject, and then you have the cutting. So God cuts Abraham. So Abraham spreads these animals out like this as proxies for himself to make this covenant with God. And God passes through them. And of course, the flame passing through the pieces is a prophecy concerning Christ, the incarnation. So my point is that God is becoming one flesh with Abraham. So just as Adam pierces Eve and splits the left from the right, so God with mankind becomes incarnate. And to show this to Abraham, he compares it and likens it to a marriage of God piercing Abraham in much the same way as Adam pierces Eve. And it's a metaphor, yes, but metaphors are real and actual. So we see this actually fulfilled and played out when Christ becomes flesh, becomes a man like us. That is, God becomes one flesh with mankind. And he does that through the virgin woman, through Mary, and literally as God passed through the pieces of the animals to the left and right, when Christ is born of Mary, he passes through Mary and becomes one flesh with the human race. So not only do we see this in the incarnation and the birthing of Christ, as God passing through the left and the right sides of Mary, the pieces of humanity, if you will, and making a covenant with us, cutting us, if you will, a covenant. When he's been crucified, he's also pierced in the side with a lance, which corresponds to the creation of Eve out of Adam's body, when God pierced the side of Adam and took a rib out and fashioned a bride for Adam. So in the same way, Christ is pierced, and what happens? Blood and water flow out. And we know that the church is the body of Christ. And there again, we have a picture of the macrocosm and the microcosm. So we have the essential person of Christ, two natures, fully God, fully man. His body is pierced, but it is also the foundation stone of the body of the church, who is the bride of Christ, the bride of God. And so God pierces his own body, unites it to himself, in much the same way that a man pierces his wife and unites her to him. And she signifies this by piercing her ears, which is the beginning place of where she first heard his words. Like the Virgin Mary heard the words of Christ, the Logos of Christ in her ear, and conceived and bore a son in the exact likeness of God. So we have there the double meaning of zakar, to pierce but also to remember, to hear, to be impressed, and therefore reproduce an icon of God in the person of Christ. And of course, Christ is not merely a likeness, he is God in the flesh. So he is a perfect icon, he is God. Now, in saying all this, I just want to be clear that, of course, the Virgin Mary is ever virgin, most holy, ever Virgin Mary, Mother of God. So she was not pierced in the same way that a normal woman is pierced during marriage. I'm not saying that at all. Mary conceived the Logos, the Word of God, through her ear. But it is very telling to us, for women who are not the mothers of God, normal women, if you will, why they pierce their ears and what that signifies and why it's good and how it corresponds to their nature as God created them. So having covered basically the essential meaning of what it means for a woman to pierce her ears, you can tell something about a particular individual and how she pierces her ears and what that might mean. And just one example I will give is what I've noticed is that when girls get excessive piercings running up the side of their ear, I've noticed that basically on girls who associate with effeminate men, is that they're trying to maintain their passive position by out-womaning these effeminate men. So you have these effeminate men who act like women, and the women around them want to be more womanly than these womanly men, and they try to do that by getting excessive piercings in their ears to outdo the men, so to speak, in being women. But now going on to why men pierce their ears. In the Old Testament, the only reason a man would pierce his ear, you notice I said their singular ear, is when he was going to become a slave for life. And we have this law written in Exodus 21 in verse 6, where Moses describes if a slave wants to be a slave for life, his owner basically takes him to the door of his home and pierces the lobe of his ear through with an awl. And that hole in his ear then signifies that this man, his self-agency, he has yielded that to another person. In much the same way that a woman does to her husband, which is natural. But with a man, it is going beyond his natural proclivity, but it is still possible in some sense to yield his own will to another man. And he signifies that with his ear in a very similar way as a woman does by piercing both her ears. So I've heard the expression that either pirates wear earrings or men who are homosexual wear earrings. And essentially, this is true. And let me explain why. So, we have the understanding that a slave will wear an earring. We have that in antiquity, and it still indicates that today. But pirates are men driven by their passions. That is, they are men without agency of their own, and they answer to the dictates of someone else, or rather something else, that is their own passions. They give themselves away to their passions so excessively that they are driven from without side, and in a sense have no control. And therefore you have the stereotype of a pirate with earrings in his ear, and again still singular most of the time. And I have noticed a trend moving on to men piercing their ears, both ears. And I've thought about this a lot, and the only thing that I can think of is that typically the men that I see with excessive piercings is either they're gay and trying to behave as women, which is unbecoming to them, or they are extremely promiscuous men. That is, they have sex with a lot of women, and I would say to the extent that they lose their sense of initiative as men, that they no longer initiate, they're no longer the piercers, even though technically they are, but on a psychological level, they are driven completely by the allure of a woman's sexuality because they've been with so many different women. And so I've noticed that men who are either slaves, criminals, pirates, men who are driven by passions will wear earrings. The gays, of course, will wear earrings trying to be women. And then men who, even though they may be masculine in appearance, have yielded their point of initiation to their own passions by being promiscuous. And they wear earrings because they've yielded up their will to their own sins. So in these instances with men, earrings are typically bad because it doesn't correspond to how God made them. However, with women, earrings are quite attractive, they're beautiful, and quite appropriate. And I believe that women should wear earrings if they like. They don't have to, but if they like to, I believe that they are appropriate to the feminine instinct and temperament, nature. So we have there, zakar is the Hebrew word for male, which means to pierce or to memorialize, to remember, but mainly to pierce. And then you have the Hebrew word nakav for female, which means to be pierced. And so this indicates how a man and woman become one flesh, how they know each other through sexual union, how a covenant is made by two people becoming one flesh, one blood. And we see how God uses this type of covenant to join himself to the human race through the incarnation, through his passion on the cross, and ultimately through the church, who is his bride, as Eve was the bride to Adam. And one more thing to keep in mind is when we use these metaphors, which are real and actual metaphors, they're not empty metaphors, but they actually correspond to reality. When we use these metaphors, we have to understand that in using them to describe God, God existed before the metaphor. So God made man in his own image and likeness, made him male and female. That is to say, then, that we can use the male and female analogy to describe God, because it was out of God's image that the male and female reality was given to us. So it's not that we go and find a random metaphor, nature, and use it to describe God as closely as we can. We were giving the metaphor of male and female out of God himself as a likeness in the creation of man in the image and likeness of God, and God making us male and female. So I hope that helps in understanding why women wear earrings and what it signifies, and that nature is consistent and beautiful as God described it in the scriptures. That's all I have for you today. Have a good day and God bless. Thank you.